to the City of Peoria Planning and Zoning Commission. The Planning and Zoning Commission is composed of volunteer citizens appointed by the City Council. The Commission is the designated hearing body for a range of land use applications, including general plan amendments, rezones, conditional use permits, and amendments to the zoning code. Upon recommendation by the Commission, general plan amendments, rezones, and zoning code amendments proceed forward to the Peoria City Council for final action. For conditional use permits, the Commission will make a final decision subject to appeal. All hearings are conducted in accordance with the rules for procedure requirements to allow an impartial and efficient hearing, and all Commission meetings are open to the public under the Arizona Open Meeting Law. Each case will be called in the order in which it appears on the agenda unless otherwise announced during the meeting. Once called, City staff will give a presentation of the case, followed by a presentation from the applicant if they so desire. After the applicant's presentation, members of the public who have submitted a speaker's request form will be called to speak by the Commission Chair. The applicant may be called to provide additional information, clarification, or a rebuttal. The Commission will discuss the case, may ask additional questions, and take action. Any member of the public wishing to speak must complete a speaker's request form and hand it to the planning assistant at the end of the dais. When speaking, please limit your comments to a maximum of 3 minutes and try not to repeat statements already made by others. We welcome your comments, and as fellow citizens of Peoria, we thank you in advance for your participation.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Commissioner Waitman Powell, Chair. I would like to welcome everyone, staff, residents, to our October 2nd, 2025 Planning and Zoning meeting. Let's begin the night with a roll call, Commissioners. Please indicate your presence after your name is called. Vice Chair Fiason, you're absent. Commissioner Cottrell?
Present.
Thank you. Commissioner Julie Agia?
Present.
Thank you. Commissioner Fider absent. Commissioner Gaynor?
Present.
Thank you, Commissioners. We did make quorum today. Right. Thank you. I would like to let all of our attendees know that this is the final call for speaker request forms. If you'd like to address the Commission tonight, please fill out a speaker request form. We have them available at our entrance. If you weren't able to get one at the entrance, I know Mrs. Duffy has one here at the end. Let's go ahead and get started. We have our consent agenda, which all items are routine in nature. They will be enacted in one motion. And so before we get started onto our new business, we will go and have an approval for item 1C, which is the minutes of our September 18th, 2025 meeting. Do I have a motion, Commissioners?
I motion.
Thank you. Properly motioned by Commissioner Agia. Do I have a second, Commissioners?
Second.
Thank you. Properly moved and seconded by Commissioner Cottrell. Can we please go to a vote? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Thank you, Commissioners. Well, now let's get into our new business for the evening. Our new business for tonight will be item 2R, which is our middle housing code amendment. We have another study session coming up tonight, and I was excited about this one. So staff, please present. Well, we have you, Director Hawkes.
Starting.
There we go. Thank you.
Ma'am.
Please present.
Well, good evening, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. So tonight is a continuation of the topic of middle housing. So as we stated last time, this pertains to House Bill 2721. This was passed during the 2024 legislative session. You'll recall is among a suite of other bills that were passed that year that pertain to housing and zoning, particularly directly towards the issue of affordable housing. So they included things like accessory dwelling units and also the conversion of commercial space to multifamily housing. So you'll recall that last year there were a number of amendments that we brought forward to the Commission for consideration. They had a deadline of the 1st of January of 2025. All those amendments were approved and codified within our city code. Now, one of those bills had a later date for that we had to have it in place, and that's the topic of middle housing. That's what we're talking about tonight, and that has a deadline of January 1st of 2026. Now, at our last meeting, we provided an overview of the bill. We led a discussion. So tonight, I will start out and I'll provide an introduction. There were 2 questions that we took back from the commission from our last session, so we'll address those questions first. And then what we'll do is I will turn it over to Elias Valencia on my left, and he will go through the provisions. There are, although this bill is largely preemptive, there are 4 areas that we identified that do allow some level of implementation discretion, and so we'll talk to you about those items tonight as part of the bill. So in your packet, we have a copy not only of the proposed draft language of this code amendment, also a briefing sheet that summarizes the bill, and a full copy of the House Bill 2721. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into it. So just as a refresher, middle housing, this is a housing type that includes duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhouses. So often we hear about the missing middle, and so if you, when you think about the spectrum of housing options, they generally fit in between traditional single-family residential neighborhoods and larger scale multifamily on the opposite end. It is a housing type that the bill implies can be compatible with single-family residential neighborhoods. So for various reasons, this housing type has not taken root in many places in the valley, particularly in suburban areas in the valley. As I mentioned in a few minutes ago, this is largely a preemptive bill. So as we talked about last time, there are actually very few areas where we have discretion in how it can be administered. But of course, we'll talk about those areas tonight. We have to allow middle housing by right in 2 scenarios, okay? And the first scenario was parcel zoned single-family residential within 1 mile of the city's central business district. The city's central business district happens to be P83 area. The second scenario, as a refresher, is we have to allow middle housing within at least 20% of any new development over 10 contiguous 10 contiguous acres. So there isn't a good option of not having the code in place. So what the bill does provide, it does provide a penalty clause, and it says that if we don't have the code amendment in place by the deadline, January 1st, we have to allow it without any limitations until we have the language completed and codified. So that could mean things like, you think about all the things that we regulate through zoning, whether it's building height or setbacks or those things. So just to note that we most certainly are on track to have this in place by that deadline. So first, before I turn it over to Elias, I do want to follow up on a couple of questions that came up from the last commission meeting. The first one, we had some discussion about do HOA regulations, so the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, do they supersede the bill and the proposed ordinance, and can they be added? And so as we looked at it, we investigated this issue with the city attorney's office. A couple things we noted: the bill is silent on HOA compliance. While it doesn't preempt an HOA's authority, it also doesn't expressly grant authority to a municipality. And arguably, one could say that adding provisions in the code frustrates the intent of the bill. And as you read through the bill, that's one specific prohibitions in the bill, that you can't have accumulation in language and code that frustrates the intent. So that's part of it. But there's also some more other reasons that make this impractical, and I'll go through those. So CC&Rs, as you know, this is a private contract between the HOA and its residents. The city is not a party to this agreement. So therefore, we would have no legal authority to enforce a private agreement. It is unenforceable from a city perspective. So if someone came into the department and they, on a qualifying lot, and they wanted to submit plans for, let's say, a duplex in a single family lot, and it met all of our requirements, we would be obligated to approve those plans and issue that permit. Now, the HOA could certainly choose to contest the construction. They probably or likely have language in their CC&Rs that requires oversight, design review oversight. However, at the end of the day, this would be a civil matter between the HOA and the resident. But we would have to certainly fulfill our obligations under the bill and under the code language. The second question that came up was, can there be a cap on the number of middle housing units on a qualifying lot? So we had an example of somebody that said, let's say in a qualifying area, had a single family home. They tore down the single family home and they wanted to put up a duplex or 2 duplexes. Is there a maximum number of units that could be placed on that? And so as we looked at that and studied that issue, we noted that the bill does not expressly authorize a maximum unit count, and it does not, and we're not recommending adding one because the bill permits middle housing types on qualifying site zone, single-family residential. And so really the only limiting factors that we can look at are the development requirements that are applicable to the zoning district. Because again, we have to treat these housing types like we treat single-family housing types. So things like setbacks, right? That's going to limit how much you can put on the lot. Lot coverage will do that. Building height, all of those things. The parking requirements, that will also limit it. So those things collectively will limit the I guess the capacity of that site for it. Those are the things that can limit it, but we can't place a arbitrary unit count on that. So I want to pause there before I move on to the next part, because Elias is going to go through the bill or through the code in more detail, and specifically with the implementation strategies. But before I go, are there any questions on those two elements?
Yes, thank you so much, Director Hawkes. I don't have a question, but I just want to reiterate this. And so for me, just as a resident, I want this to be in layman's terms. And just to make sure that we get this, we talked about HOAs, and I just want to make sure, and this is a question I'm asking for residents because a lot of homeowners will ask this, understanding that municipalities do not have the control over HOAs, and so those restrictive covenants do protect HOAs in a way, and I just want to make sure that we're reiterating that, correct?
Madam Chair, that's correct. Yeah, that's a private agreement between those residents and the HOA. Yep.
Perfect, thank you. And then my second question was, you said there were no limitations on the lot count. Did I catch that correct?
Madam Chair, that is correct in the sense that the bill doesn't authorize us to place any cap on there. So the things that would limit how much you can put on a lot are all those development requirements that would apply to single family. That would dictate how much you can actually put on a lot.
That makes sense. So let's say, because I was reading language, like 2,200 lots, right? A developer, could they buy that lot and then convert it any way that they want to? I mean, that's a question that I have.
Madam Chair, members of the commission, so certainly a developer could purchase a lot, 2 lots, consolidate them, and they could then choose to place as many middle housing units on the lot that met all of our development requirements.
Okay.
So it's gonna squeeze all the things like setbacks, lot coverage. They're gonna squeeze the development envelope down into what can be built on it.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Commissioners, Commissioner Cottrell.
Thank you, Chris. One quick question on the HOA again. So I understand it's not a city matter, which I
Right.
understand fully. Did the city attorney give an opinion on whether the HOA could supersede the state law? So if, you create a new subdivision, you have this new HOA, the new HOA says, and there will be no middle housing. Is that a legal? Are they allowed to do that?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Control, really it's unknown. If you look at the bill, it is silent in terms of expressly authorizing it, and it doesn't speak to the issue of HOA. So it's really, until it's tested, it's really unknown at this point. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other commissioners? No, thank you. Back to you all, Director Hawkes.
6 inches.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Hawkes, for bringing us up to speed. And Madam Chair and members of the commission, I'm happy to be here again to continue through this process of getting this text amendment in place. As Mr. Hawkes mentioned, we have a tight deadline of January 1st of this coming year, but we are well on track. But tonight, we just want to give a reason of why we're here, and this is in response to that bill, right? We do have a big trade-off there. If we don't get these measures in place, then we're going to lose any ability to put any conditions on any of these single-family residential citywide. So it's very important that we're all here participating tonight, and we thank you for being here. And to summarize what the changes are as far as the whole ordinance goes, it's really going to be down to 3 main sections in the code: our definitions, our residential, a portion of our residential districts, and parking. And within those 3 sections, there's a total of 5 subsections that are impacted. And to identify what middle housing is, to create the definition and the development standards for them, and then to update the parking criteria that the bill language has included of 1 space per unit. So those are the changes that staff has identified and made that we feel are in alignment with what the bill is trying to achieve and keeps us in compliance. So tonight we're going to talk over those and see some of these scenarios, as Mr. Huck has mentioned, where there was a little bit of discretion, and we need your expert input to see if staff's approach was in the right direction. Now, as a preemptive bill, there are certain conditions that we cannot place on middle housing. So those are identified here. But the third one there, where it says restrict a floor area ratio, we're going to get more in depth on that as we go further in the presentation. But as you see there, we have the 1 parking space criteria and all these other conditions that normally many cities or jurisdictions would try to implement those type of arrangements to control a certain type of product. That is not the case here. In fact, what we're going to be doing is discussing 4 key scenarios where staff had to use discretion in interpreting what the bill left as very vague and general language. As we present each one of these items, we'll go over the staff's approach, what their recommendation is, and of course, seek and solicit your input so that we can make this language more palatable and so that it's not open for ambiguity. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and start with the first part of the bill that was very vague. In the bill, it calls out as an eligible criteria that we need to allow middle housing in all single-family residential districts within 1 mile of the city's central business district. In this case, the P83 entertainment area. So the question that we had to answer is, should single-family residential districts include other areas that allow single-family residential, such as our planned area developments or planned community developments? So in analyzing that, staff took into consideration that a PAD and a PCD, although it does allow for a single-family residential use, it was also a customized zoning district. So there are a lot of other criteria and conditions that go into allowing those type of developments as a part of a unified development. Those context-specific regulations could, in effect, be upheaved by allowing an anything-goes approach on those single-family lots. The other fact is that it is considered an overlay and not an actual zoning district. So in taking that into consideration, staff's recommendation was to exclude PAD and PCD districts from being considered as single-family residential zones. And so that is the question that we had. That was the approach and the analysis behind that. And at this point, we'd like to hear from the commission if their thoughts are, if staff's in the right direction or if this needs to be redirected in any way.
Thank you, Mr. Valencia. What I'll do is I'll open it up to the commission. Commissioners, any questions? Perfect. Commissioner Cottrell?
Yeah, same type of PAD question. So do you have you, maybe I should put, have you talked with other cities, got other legal opinions on that? Is that exposing Peoria? You know, I just imagine a developer that's in a PAD and the PAD is existing, it's all generally equivalent to some residential zoning district, and they claim that. I mean, is that exposing us to risk, or is Glendale taking the same stance as Phoenix, et cetera, et cetera?
Oh, Madam Chair and Commissioner Cottrell, so we did coordinate with other jurisdictions as well. They were at different processes at points during the process, and each jurisdiction does have different classifications for their single-family residential and other type of developments. The model league language also just identifies the bill language and keeps it the same as single-family residential. So there was some teaming up there as far as trying to see what would be the avenue to take. But in this case, each jurisdiction is handling it in its own way. But also, Director Hawkins?
Yep. Thank you for that, Elias. And just to add a little more to his points is that we have talked with other jurisdictions about how they intend to implement this. There is a model ordinance that was provided by the League of Arizona Cities, And so in looking at most of the city's approach was to stay true to the bill. So the bill talks about single-family residential districts, and in our code, we have a chapter that applied. There's a number of districts that are called single-family districts. We're also including suburban ranch because that is a type of single-family district. With the prospect of PADs, PCDs, we look at those slightly differently in that they are constructed with different development standards. They are built that way so that they better comply with the context in the area. And so we see them as more of a customized zoning district, not purely within the structure of what the bill was looking for, which was true, just pure single-family residential districts. And secondly, when we look at the graphic here as well, I'll note that in our older areas, we have very few PAD or PCDs. Most of those districts have occurred up in the northern areas of the city. If we were to look within 1 mile of PD3, I can't identify more than 1 or 2 PADs or PCDs that would even be in this. Most of these areas are straight zone, single family, or suburban ranch anyway.
Thank you, Director Hawkes. All good. Commissioner Cottrell, awesome. Do we have any other questions, commissioners? I do have one question, and maybe for you, Mr. Valencia or Director Hawkes. One thing that, I've heard residents say is that they're concerned about, the neighborhood character and how this would impact the neighborhood character. And so I was reading, and one thing that I did see is that, both the middle housing can mimic single-family housing, and we would not go over 30 feet, which is usually approximately 2 stories. And so can we elaborate a little bit on that? Because I think the neighborhood character was one thing that I heard a lot when we were talking about the missing middle housing and resident concerns.
Madam Chair, members of the commission, that's a great question, and we've certainly, last year as we were looking at those other code amendments, and as we were considering this one, we've been, we've definitely been very keen on what's going on in other communities too. We've heard some of those conflict as well. So the way this bill is constructed, it says we can't limit middle housing to 1 story, right? And so to your point, though, I can tell you in all of our single-family residential districts, they all have a maximum height of 30 feet. So we would have to allow this to be no more than 30 feet, but we'd have to treat them like single-family homes.
Thank you for that point of clarification. That was my main question. I don't have any other questions, commissioners. Commissioner Agia?
So I'm relatively new to the commission, right? And when you guys work with developers, and when they're looking at building these multifamily units, are we able to have input on where they would be within the development itself? Like, if they want to just blend it within the neighborhood, or are we able to have some type of say on where in the development those multifamily units would be?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Agia, absolutely. It depends on the disposition of the property. What do I mean by that is, if somebody is coming to modify the zoning, right? They're looking to change the zoning, and perhaps they are proposing multifamily as part of that. That zoning case is evaluated. We'll look at the density. There might be multiple housing types as part of that zoning case. We'll look at where that's at. What does that edge condition look like? Zoning cases, of course, require neighborhood meetings. They do come in front of the commission. You will have direct input in that case and go to council. If it's a piece of property that's already zoned multifamily, then we have a site plan requirement, and that's more administrative. And what that means is we have to confirm that the zoning and development standards that we've already established are met by that development. So we have less discretion. We certainly can use our design guidelines and our discussions, and there could be neighborhood input in terms of how that site plan is shaped, but ultimately, really the most level discretion is at the zoning level when something gets rezoned.
And just for my clarification, just because with my background, sometimes when we do see the multifamily units, crimes tends to go up, depending on where those units are. So what I'm hearing you say is that, like, the regulations that will be for the residential housing will be the same for the multi-housing, as far as like lighting, space, street lighting, all that kind of stuff.
Madam Chair, members of the commission, so outside of those very specific zoning requirements, we also have engineering requirements that
Okay.
dictate the spacing of lighting, the width of roadways and so forth, all those other things that apply to those neighborhoods.
Okay.
Great question, Commissioner Agia. She's new, but as you see, she's fitting right in. I do have one more question, and I think this is one that would go once again to resident concern. Are there any stipulations on parking? And I think I'm going to be asking that more throughout the night. Any stipulations, any elaboration on parking? Our city is growing, right? And so this is a necessity, but also thinking about parking, I'm thinking about handicap parking spaces specifically. And so any elaboration on that as we continue to grow and build?
Madam Chair, members of the commission, so as it applies to single-family housing, so we have in our zoning code, there are prescriptions for how much on-site parking you have to have. Now, for this bill, it says we can require no more than one space for a middle housing type. However, if you're a single-family house, we would require more parking. So, for example, if you have on-site parking that's allowed, you have the width of the roadway that allows for on-site parking, we would require 2 spaces. If you do not, if it's a narrower roadway, we would require 3 spaces per unit. So this is all kind of prescribed in our zoning code, but that's the oddity here is that despite that and despite the impetus to treat single-family and middle housing the same way, this would require that we allow no more or require no more than 1 space for middle housing unit.
Thank you for that clarification, Director Hawkes. I'm just thinking, just because I'm thinking about the reality, I think middle housing is good, but the reality of, one-car households is very hard in contemporary society. And so even middle housing, I'm thinking, the average household that I know within Peoria is a 2-car household. That is almost required now. We are not as, I guess, progressive as Phoenix and have a lot of other transportation options. And so parking, that's maybe something that I might be a little concerned about because, one parking spot, is there a garage? I have questions now. And so definitely want to know more about how we're going to go about that and address that. Because one thing that I think makes neighborhoods not that accessible, even for public safety, is if you ever been to to an overcrowded one-way street and people are parking all on the car, and now you have one small alley to get through. You're getting in between cars, and for sure, maybe middle housing, some of those households that have more tenants, right? And so children, young adults, and so I'm thinking about those things when kids come home from college and high schoolers. And so I'm just really thinking about accessibility for public safety as well in those neighborhoods. And, think if you have some public safety, and I'm going to tap on my fellow commissioner here, they have some SUVs, there's certain ways we want to get in and out, and then fire and medical. And so I'm just thinking about that, when you're talking about parking, where would they park, what would happen, and hoping that is not a safety issue. Yes.
Madam Chair, understood. And even though for middle housing we couldn't require more than 1 space, we're hoping the market will respond appropriately. So if you've got a buyer profile that comes in, that buyer profile may require more than 1 space, and they'll adjust accordingly.
Thank you. Absolutely. And I know that has economic implications, and that will be more research that won't be on our end. But thank you for that clarification. It's just something I do want to lift up as we continue to grow. Commissioner Agia made a few comments about, possibly rising crime, things that can happen. But as we have those stipulations, I think one thing that really helps is already having those provisions in place, letting residents know that there is going to be, ingress and people are going to exit and be able to come in and out, and there's space for all those things. I'm thinking about fires. I'm thinking about these things because it happens, right? We're living in neighborhoods. And so if we can push back, I'd definitely be one of those pushing back on more parking space. Any other commissioners?
Yeah, I have a quick
Commissioner Gaynor, and we'll go to Commissioner G after.
Yeah, thank you. Mine should be easy, but are you expecting a lot of legal challenges as it relates to? I mean, you're trying to stay true to the legislation, but as you've gone through this process, I know you've gone through it with a fine-tooth comb. Are you already planning or expecting some challenges as it relates to, how Peoria writes this code, and how an attorney might feel something can be appealed, and how far it can be taken. Can you just share that with us? And the reason I ask is for the cost to the city, because the city has to address these things. And also, historically, I know this city is less complicated, but and at least it is now. But other cities are much more complicated. So, could you give me some feedback on that?
Madam Chair, members of the commission. So we've worked very closely in collaboration with our city attorney's office, and we've also, as I mentioned, been in contact with other cities as we've constructed the bill. The reality is this bill provides very little discretion. So our ordinance is constructed very narrowly and very similarly to other jurisdictions because, we're talking about one item tonight. We have 3 other items where we have some level of discretion because the bill is silent in those areas. And so we are identifying an approach that we're looking to get input on, but the reality is there just isn't a lot of room. So our ordinance will look very similar, if not nearly identical, to what other cities are enacting.
Thank you. Commissioner Gia?
Just back to the parking, I think HOAs might have something to say about that as well, but you guys might already be looking ahead as we navigate this, but like common parking areas, would that be allowed in these middle housing complexes where they would be able to create a common parking area for the other residents? Just something to think about. So.
Madam Chair, members of the commission, as we look at our parking code, I mean, certainly when we're looking at, overall parking standards, we certainly do look for group or visitor parking for multifamily developments. We don't have that prescription for single family. It certainly is something we could consider. This bill doesn't allow us to require more than 1 space for a unit, but that's not to say that through a review of a larger proposal, we couldn't look at some of those areas for group parking.
Okay, Commissioner Cottrell has a follow-up question.
Hey, Chris, this parking is, so I'm imagining, I think like a developer. I'm picturing within this area, so one of these R16 zones, somebody goes, buys a house, tears it down, their choices would be, if I'm understanding this correct, I could rebuild a new home, 2,000 square foot, something typical, and it would require 3 parking spaces. But if I build same square footage, but now I magically call it a townhouse that has 2 units, I only need 2 total parking spaces. And so it seems like it's a loophole where now I could fit more house on there and take advantage of it.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Cottrell, you're absolutely correct. It's one of the misalignments between the bill language and, whereas in most cases you have to treat single family and middle housing the same, it does provide for a different standard for this housing type than we would for single family, and that's very true. Yeah.
Is that providing any concern for you, or some of these other options, or HOAs that put the restrictions on that the city can't?
Madam Chair and Commissioners, we're always concerned when there is a large level of preemptions, whereas the local community can't have a voice in what those local standards are. So yes, we're never a fan of these preemptions like this. We're having to construct a code amendment that aligns with the bill, and we'll work with it the best we can, but we're limited by that.
Thank you. One thing as we close this up, because I do understand it's a football Thursday, and my household, faith, family, and football, so I'm trying to get there too. I just really want to commend staff for even going into the resource, connecting with Arizona League of Cities and Towns and cities. I sometimes mess that one up. But I think that's a great resource because that's where all cities come together and you guys can really co-collaborate and kind of, like Commissioner Cottrell said, compare what is this city doing and what are you all doing. And I know you guys also have the Planning Association. And so I just want to thank you all for doing that research and already talking about what other cities are doing and then making the right decisions and presenting what we can do here in Peoria, because I do think it's important to see what neighboring cities are doing. So thank you all staff for that. We'll hand it back to you all to move along. Thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the commission, thank you so much for your direction and input on the scenario, the first item that we needed some input on. But as we started making headway in the text language, then we hit another hurdle immediately with the second scenario, where the bill requires us to permit middle housing for 20% of new development that's more than 10 contiguous areas. It just left it at that. 20% of what? Do they mean the number of units or the acreage? So looking at the Model League for guidance and using other similar amendments from the past, we decided that 20% of the gross acreage is an appropriate modifier for what they mean by 20% of new development. So at that point, now we solicit your feedback here. Is that a good approach? Please let us know.
There we go. I'm really trying to make it to the game, but I do have a question. No, I love that we're here able to serve and assist a city. And so when you're talking about 20% should basically occupy middle housing, the question that came up, what if only 10% of the area is occupied, and then what happens to the rest of that kind of, that ambiguity, that word, that there is within that language? And can we just elaborate on that a little bit more? Because it is, 20%, maybe they occupy 10%, and then it could be something else. Once again, seeing if there's loopholes around that.
Madam Chair, members of the commission, and we're trying to add, as we implement these zoning codes, we try to retreat away from ambiguity, so we know how to implement it. Everybody has certainty in how it's implemented. And so when we think of 20%, we're thinking, the bill says up to 20% of a development parcel, up to 20%. So if they want to do 10%, they're fine. They're well within their range. But we think it's more appropriate to utilize the gross acreage of whatever that site is as the modifier instead of the unit count, because you could have 10 gross acres and maybe somebody wants to put a whole bunch of units. 20% of a whole bunch of units is a lot. So we'd rather just look at the area and make sure that housing type is in scale with the rest of the development.
Thank you for that elaboration, Director Hawkes. Any other questions, commissioners? Yes, Commissioner Gaynor?
So how do you see, and I'm coming back to you for your expertise as it relates to, if you're permitting 20%, what happens to your ability to require open areas, parks, walking, parks behind homes, and all the things we do to make neighborhoods look great?
Madam Chair, members of the commission, so this in no way would change our existing ordinances. And what I mean by that is we have design review requirements. So whenever there's a development that's in place, there's a certain percentage of not only of active open space areas that are required, and if it happens to be in our northern reaches, there's also natural open space that's required in addition to the active open space. So those are requirements that will still be in place no matter if it's middle housing or single family.
Thank you. After you said that, I knew that already, but thanks for the reminder. I didn't think of it. So thank you for the clarification. That's great.
Okay, Madam Chair, members of the commission. So then the third item we needed a specific approach on was where the language mentions that we cannot put certain conditions on our middle housing products. One of them that they talk about in the language is floor area ratio. Now, floor area ratio, or FAR, is a way that they measure and limit the intensity of certain buildings by taking the total floor area by the total height. Now, in the entire city of Peoria, we do not use floor area ratio for any development. What we use is lot coverage and setbacks to limit the intensity of buildings. No, taking into consideration that our single-family residential districts have a maximum height of 30 feet, we don't understand why floor area ratio would have come up as a consideration. As you see in the graphic there, you take a 4-story building and say, but that wouldn't even be an option in a single-family residential zone. So taking that into consideration, staff decided that using and continuing to maintain the consistency of using lot coverage and setbacks to limit the intensity of middle housing product, which is identical to all of our other single-family residential development standards, lot coverage and setbacks, that would be the approach that would be best to fit the bill's language and also meet the intent of implementing middle housing. So with that in mind, we just want to hear if the commission feels that that was a good approach.
Any questions, suggestions, commissioners, comments? Commissioner Cottrell.
Since you're asking the question, it is a good approach.
We appreciate that, and FAR is used in some circumstances, some PADs, but really it's more applicable to commercial industrial intensity. It's a measure of intensity, so that's why it was odd to construct the bill with relative to single family. We use maximum lot coverage.
Nice. And then we have Commissioner Gaynor.
No, I just had a thumbs up.
There we go. So we got a 4 thumbs up. Great, doing great, staff. Keep going.
Chair Whitman Powell and members of the commission. So as we made it towards the end of the language, there was one other area that was very ambiguous. It was with the exemptions. What doesn't allow, what type of conditions would exist that wouldn't permit middle housing? Now the bill specifically says that areas that are lacking water and sewer and that are within the vicinity of a military airport are excluded. But then it says also areas that lack sufficient urban services. That was it, urban services. What does that even mean? So because of the fact that water and sewer were already identified, urban services has to be something beyond that. Staff's approach was all single family residential requires utilities in order to be permitted. So the utilities that were not called out were waste and electrical. Thus, staff's approach was that in order to qualify for middle housing, the area would also have to be able to have electric and waste service. And that was the approach. So to define urban services to mean providing electric and refuse service. That good takeaway?
That's great. Do we have any questions, commissioners? Commissioner
I have-
Gaynor?
I have a question. So do you have, within the city of Peoria, do you have homes that have access to wells, that are still in Peoria, that are away from services, but somehow the neighbors have been able to get services? I mean, are there any neighborhoods like that?
Commissioner Waitman Powell and members of the commission, there may be some older homes that may have been annexed in from the county area or some very early on developed homes that may have had some of those well permits or things of that nature. But when it comes to the scope of this bill and the type of properties that would qualify, it's the 1 mile from the central business district, those are all near infrastructure and utility areas. The areas that are, open for 20% of the total development would have to then at that point prove that they have the capacity or the resource to get that electric and refuse service. So in essence, that if they can't provide the water, then it would not be eligible for middle housing at that point.
Okay. Thought I'd ask the question.
Thank you. And then we have Commissioner Gia.
So I just pulled up urban services. So it also includes like policing and firefighting. And I know the area that I currently work, a lot of the, we're seeing like a very uptick in population because of multifamily housing going in and a lot of high rises and stuff. And the police and the fire department staffing is not able to keep up with the growth of the city that I work in. Are we considering what that would look like moving forward with this multi-housing as well? I think that would be something to consider.
Madam Chair, members of the commission, interesting idea, though. You could include urban services to mean also, and I'm just making something up here, that it's within the response area of fire and police. That could certainly be included or appended to the definition of urban services, if that
Yeah.
was the will of the commission.
There's like federal staffing models out there that I don't have them memorized, but I want to say it's like 2 to 1 or something like that, 2.5 officers for every 1,000 residents, but something to make sure that they are going to get those services and that they have the staffing models in place to get them. So
Right.
something to think about.
No, it's a great thought. We would have to have a way to administer that. So just my thoughts here would be, we certainly understand if an area is within that response radius, and that might be a way to do that. But we could certainly think about that some more. That's a great suggestion, though.
Commissioner Cottrell?
thank you. I had noted this last time, reading the actual bill. And it's one section that says, notwithstanding subsection A, utility provider impacted by the development, blah, 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 shall have the opportunity to review and approve the site plan for the development. So, again, flipping the coin, does that mean that the city of Peoria, being the utility provider, just wiped out everything else? So you could say, I'm just reviewing the site plan, and no, you can't have 5 units on here because I don't like the site plan. Is there some interpretation or opinion on that? Because it seems a loophole in the other direction in the city's favor.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Cottrell, we thought about that provision too, because it's very unusual. And now we do have areas that are not served by Peoria. We have areas that are served by EPCOR, that they provide the water service, for example. And so in those cases, the way the bill reads is we would be required to transmit the site plan to them and allow them the opportunity to review. Now it says approve too, right? We are the approval authority when it comes to site plans. And so I don't believe that a utility could, let's say, deny a proposal for some other reason other than what's required in the code. The code is the language and the regulations that apply within our city limits. So I don't think that would be enforceable.
And is there any, I mean, it's not in this actual law, but it doesn't state what your terms would be for denying that you could just say we don't have enough water? Or is there an actual restriction that says we have to have proof in some fashion, or we don't have sewer capacity, or do you have to have, is it open-ended that, I'm again playing devil's advocate here.
Yep, Madam Chair, Commissioner Cottrell. So we certainly have criteria that we utilize in not only consideration of a site plan, but approval of site plan. And so, we do have those things that are already in place that we have to, that we're obligated to review it in a contention with. But also, as far as the utility, I think with the way the bill reads is they have to have the ability to provide service. And so that, and I think it says, did it say enhance saving water and sewer? I think it was water and sewer. So they have to be able, developer has to be able to show, and the utility has to agree that they have the ability to provide water, sufficient water and sewer service to this development.
Back to you all. Thank you.
Okay, so Madam Chair, members of the commission, thank you for that valuable input. It's going to help us to refine any of these languages as we continue to go forward in the process. You see, that January 1st is coming close, but we'll be seeing you all in 2 weeks again with some updates on based off of the feedback that you provided us. And for all those that are following along at home or that were interested in the text amendment, the language has been online. The draft ordinance has been available since the 25th of September. And so we continuously update that page. We have the presentations and the history of this project so far. But coming up next, okay, we'll see you in 2 weeks. And then hopefully with that recommendation made that night, we can forward that along to the City Council in November 18th to be exact. Any other questions for us regarding the Middle Housing Text Amendment tonight?
No, Mr. Valencia, I don't think there's any more ambiguity. Had to pick on you. I know, that's a tongue twister. I think we are clear. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. We'll move along. Thank you, commissioners, staff, for that wonderful discussion. What I would like to do is move us along to our next item, which will be item 3R, which is our development workshop series, wireless communication facilities. Staff, please present. Will we have you, Mr. Gleason? Thank you. Please present, Mr. Gleason.
Thank you, Chair, members of the commission. Hopefully I don't blow your eardrums out talking into this too loudly. I know that there is a football game on tonight, so I won't tell you how many slides I have in here. I'll just let you see the bad news. But what we wanted to do was follow up in regards to Lori's presentation and explanation that she had last time regarding conditional use permits, and add some additional information as it relates to something that we very often see as a conditional use permit, and that's wireless communication facilities. They often have a lot of questions around them. They often have a great deal of concern associated with them. So we wanted to try and disseminate as much information as we can and really talk about our interaction as it relates to not only our regulations, but also state and federal regulations as well, and how those interplay with each other. This is a study session, so ask questions as we go through. Don't feel like you can't interrupt. That's the whole purpose of this, is to have a conversation and hopefully provide as much information as possible. So wireless communication facility, that sounds like an extremely esoteric, bureaucratic term. Ultimately, all that means is a cell tower. It is a communication facility that's intended to transmit radio frequency and microwaves over the air in order to transmit a signal to a sending and receiving post at the other end, with the intention of conveying all sorts of information, whether that's voice, data, imagery. It can be a whole host of items. Really, everything you get on your phone, everything you see on the internet has been conveyed through these methods. So to take a step back and talk about what the normal circumstance is when evaluating a planning application, and then we'll go into the oddities of what's different with a wireless communication facility. So in normal circumstances, what the city is evaluating based on and what we create our criteria and code off of is generally, and this sounds like an overly broad term, but health, safety, and welfare. Now that translates to a lot of different things, especially depending on someone's perspective, but ultimately it's seeking to implement standards that preserve context and character for the city as a whole and specific development proposals in particular. So home rule and Dillon rule. I'm going to be going through a ton of terms that sound completely ridiculous, but I promise there's a reason behind it. Home rule versus Dillon rule. Home rule is generally the concept that the state operates as its own entity and provides really limited bounds for local jurisdictions, and ultimately provides the opportunity for those jurisdictions to create regulations over a broad spectrum of items, meaning that they are not pinning down the specific regulations or parameters of a local jurisdiction's authority. Now, a Dillon rule is just the opposite. Dillon rule, the concept is that a jurisdiction is limited to essentially only those allowances or regulations that the state allows it to consider. So it's the term within that court case is that the local jurisdiction is a creature of the state. You can't operate without that state authority. It used to be that Arizona was considered more of a home rule state. I would say now we kind of straddle the line between the two, particularly in light of our discussions about middle housing. Wireless facilities, not to give a spoiler alert, but is completely on the Dillon rule end of things. The concept there is that not just state preemptions, but federal preemptions limit a wide array of what we can consider and evaluate when we're going through a development proposal for a wireless facility. So again, with the ridiculous terms, macro sites, ultimately all that means is a larger wireless facility. Small cell is those smaller scale things. The biggest difference between those two, and I try and equate it to folks similar to a highway. You can get anywhere on a 2-lane highway. If you have a lot of people on a 2-lane highway, you're going to get there really slowly. What small cell does, so the macro site is that main freeway infrastructure. What the small cell does, that's the equivalent of adding lanes to the freeway. So you're still getting to the same location, you're just not sitting there for 15 minutes looking at your phone waiting for the website to load. So wanted to give some background to those terms, and we'll be covering them a little bit more. With regard to locations, there's really, when you break it down, 2 primary locations that cell towers are located in. Within the right-of-way, which essentially means within city commonly owned space, generally occupied by streets. You have utilities in there, and we'll get into what the state did in a minute. But then you have private property, and really the focus of the zoning ordinance is the evaluation of development proposals on private property. And in order to solidify that within the zoning ordinance, it specifically states that the purview of that is the evaluation on private property for wireless facilities. We can touch on, and I'm sure there'll be questions with respect to those facilities that are within the right-of-way, but ultimately that would fall outside of planning purview and outside of what we would discuss with the commission. For design, we refer to it as stealth design. Ultimately, all that means is we're trying to evaluate a tower proposal that tries to blend in with the surroundings. They don't always do a good job, as you'll see, but ultimately the idea is that you are providing something that is of an aesthetic level that's more compatible with its surroundings. Non-stealth facilities would be just the opposite of that. So I wanted to give you some images to have in your head as we're going through these, so that we can kind of have a better idea of ultimately what we're talking about here. And I'm a really big nerd, so I know where all these sites are if you have questions about that. But on the left side, the macro sites, ultimately those are those primary freeway infrastructure items. They're not adding capacity, they're getting you to a destination. On the right-hand side, you'll see small cell sites, and those are the capacity measures that are being built into that wireless infrastructure. You can see, not only from a scale perspective, they're much smaller, but ultimately the design, even as a non-stealth facility, is much better than what you would see for a non-stealth macro site. The reason for that is it's usually an individual carrier that's providing antenna on a small cell facility, so they need a limited amount of antennas, and they're not reaching a broad area with those. It's intended for highly localized use or connectivity. So right-of-way versus private property, I'll just point out that the one that you see there on private property is a great example. You can't tell that's a cell site. That's really what we strive for, but we'll get into why we're kind of limited on that capacity. Yep.
Sorry, is that by Walmart?
No. The private property is located at Vistancia's clubhouse, and then the right-of-way location is 91st Avenue in Beardsley.
Mr. Gleason, one quick question, just before we get too deep into it. I noticed different kind of appeal, right? Options for macro sites and micro sites. Does the city have a input on what they would rather see? I know that the private property that might have some financial implications and might cost more, but do we have kind of control over where these are placed, or will that be with with the wireless communication center, or what they would look like, what option we would have. Because, I mean, I have seen them. I mean, the one at headquarters looks familiar. Now me and my husband will go for dinner, and I'm like, there goes one, and I'll be like you. Like, I'm a seek them out. But do we have control over that? Because I think that's another thing, like when we're talking about neighborhood character, that, you know, we may have some residents that are like, I don't want this, you know, tall tower, you know, right here. So do we have input? Because I do want to mention, I'm gaining an understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that this is a necessity with a growing city, right? If not, we will start having communication issues across the city. Things will take longer. And I'm even thinking about the safety implications around that. And so this is a necessity with a growing city, and that's why we're really talking about this preemptively in this moment.
Chair, Commission members, that's absolutely correct. You know, one of the locations within the city in particular that has had a lot of constraints from a connectivity standpoint, well, really two, northern portions of Estancia and then West Wing. Ultimately West Wing, because you're sitting in between those two mountains, there is not a tower on the top of either of those mountains. And then in addition to that, you know, you're having to angle in based off the roadway in order to get that line of sight connection. Now, ultimately, to address your first question, prior to 2017, we had huge latitude as far as our ability to regulate and evaluate wireless facilities within the right-of-way. 2017, Arizona State Legislature, in their infinite wisdom, chose to remove that latitude and basically evaluate wireless carriers as utility operators. In a sense, you know, it makes sense. They're providing an infrastructure that, to your point, addresses emergency services. So in a situation like North Estancia and or West Wing, there was constraint for quite a few years in getting signal up there, and when folks would be at home, if they would have an emergency situation, sometimes there might be connectivity issues. To address that, you know, the city is not a wireless provider, but ultimately, you know, we try and facilitate whatever needs citizens have to the extent that we can. So when we get a wireless provider that comes in to evaluate those, similar to the West Wing facility that we saw a few meetings ago, we try and evaluate and balance, this is a need within that community, but how do we ensure that it still fits in and has the appropriate context measures to evaluate based on its surroundings? So prior to 2017, I was one of the folks that was part of a team along with our engineering group, and we would sit down and evaluate proposals within the right-of-way. And we had a great deal of success making these look a whole lot better than what they come in without evaluation for. And the city still tries to do that wherever possible. An example would be we had a small cell facility within the right-of-way that was trying to go on a light pole in front of someone's house. They're not gonna like that, I can just tell you. We get calls regularly on those sorts of items. And so we tried to work with the provider to evaluate, okay, where is the bounds of the area that you need to locate this in? And how can we better situate it? Because we have to allow it on that streetlight pole. Where can we better situate it? One, so that it's not an eyesore for these people, but two, it still gets you what you need from a service perspective. So even despite that 2017 bill, we still try and work with providers and, to be quite honest, ask for, you know, whatever we can to make it more of a partnership rather than a top-down, we're going here and, you know, we're not going to consider any city goals or aspirations with the facilities. So it's it's more so trying to partner with them in order to get what works best for everybody. I'll say it's just different since 2017.
Okay. Thank you for that elaboration, Mr. Gleason. And I just want to commend the city for really taking into consideration like the neighborhood character and the residents' concerns about the neighborhood character changing or having something in front of their house. But then also I want to raise that connectivity is a basic human need in contemporary society. We need connectivity. This is how we keep people safe, and we want that to be effective connectivity. And so I'm hoping as we talk about this that there's an educational component for sure for residents, right, about why connectivity is necessary and why the city has to place it in certain areas, and then making that a collaborative effort to preserve the character of those cities. And so thank you for that elaboration, but great points. Thank you.
And Chairwoman, Commission members, to your point, what we call for on private property, because we have ordinance criteria that we can implement to a limited extent on that, is that we do look for those facilities to be co-locatable, meaning that they will have the opportunity to have other wireless providers on that same tower, so that we don't have an over-proliferation of towers. We don't need a tower 10 feet away from another tower. If we call for it to be co-locatable, we at least have one verticality rather than many.
Thank you. Any questions, commissioners? No, we don't have any anymore. Thank you. Please continue. Thank you, Mr. Gleason.
So what you see here is a little bit of decent stealth, a little bit of bad stealth, and then non-stealth. So that, for lack of a better term, tripod that you see there behind the church, that houses several wireless antenna behind the screen or the guise of the religious display in front of it. And then ultimately you see what should be a pine tree of sorts immediately next to it. I will say we've gotten much better at evaluating these. This one was built, I want to say, early mid 2000s. I think it was like 2005 or so. So we've gotten better, and we're seeking ways to ensure that the stealth design isn't just thrown together. It's thoughtful, but I'll get into why we're somewhat constrained on that. So anybody that likes Schoolhouse Rock, I just wanted to have that there for you. But ultimately, the biggest basis of our preemption is at the federal level for wireless facilities, particularly on private property. And so I wanted to give a little bit of background about where that all started, and ultimately what those federal regulations and the subsequent FCC orders call for and limit us on. So in 1934, Congress passed the Communications Act. At that time, really it was focused on radio broadcast signal and communication transmissions for the purposes of limited television. I think, what was it, the Olympics in the late 30s that was transmitted across the globe. But the big piece to evaluate here for that bill was the creation of the Federal Communications Corporation, or Commission, I'm sorry. And so what that created was essentially a rulemaking body that would implement regulations that enforce the provisions intended by those bills. So similar to what you have at the state level, for instance, because I'm sure Chris will make me come up here about group homes, but the facilities within the state that are group homes have state regulations, and then they have a state agency or body that implements rules that are intended to further those regulations. So that is essentially what the FCC does on a federal level as it relates to broadcast transmissions. So in 1996, Congress then passed the Telecommunications Act. Now, there was a whole host of legislation in between the 30s and the 90s, I promise. But ultimately, when you boil it down to wireless facilities, these are really the two key seminal pieces of legislation that get us to where we are today. And what that 1996 legislation did was it focused on telecommunications. So, very rudimentary at the time, but providing cellular service as it was in the 90s when you would hold a brick phone to your face. That overhauled the 1934 specifically to implement the telecommunications pieces. And it focused on facilitating telecommunications infrastructure, Madam Chair, to your point, in order to view it not only as a method of emergency services and transmission for those services, but ultimately, when you read through a lot of the legislation and the following orders, there's a huge focus on economic development within that legislation and those subsequent orders, because it's viewed not only to provide those daily necessities, calling 911 if you need to from your home, but for the development of our economy and getting not only jobs going, but ultimately connecting our communities. There's a lot of key pieces to it, but ultimately one of the things that is specifically stated in there, and a lot of the following orders that cover implementation of this legislation focus on, is the preemption for the evaluation of health as it relates to RF emissions. So that's really the most common question that we get from folks and from citizens whenever we have a proposal for a wireless facility is, have you thought about what this is going to do to the health of the people around it? And we'll get into it a little bit more, but ultimately there's federal guidelines that the transmission has to comply with, but it preempts the city or the local jurisdiction from having any evaluation in any possible health concerns about RF emissions or microwave emissions from any wireless facilities. Any questions on that? Okay. So these declaratory rulings, are essentially those rulemaking sheets that the FCC puts out. They're all at least 150 pages, and it's 150 pages of the same stuff repeatedly. There have been several key pieces that have come out, but for our purposes, I wanted to boil it down to really three key rulings that the FCC has put out. One was in 2009, and that was a tectonic shift in how local jurisdictions had to evaluate these proposals, and the reason for that is the implementation of what's termed in there and what's generally referred to as shot clocks. Basically a start and end period as to when a jurisdiction not only has to evaluate any preliminary plans for it, but when you have to approve the building permit. We have some subsequent slides that'll cover that a little bit more in detail, but that was really the focus of that 09 ruling. Subsequent to that, in 2014, and kind of the genesis for us rewriting the wireless code that we have in the zoning ordinance today, is the 14153 ruling. That implemented really one thing for the 14 ruling, and that was with respect to what's termed substantial change. That is an overly broad term to basically say that wireless providers, once they have a facility up, the intent of that was to facilitate co-location and or expansion of those existing facilities. And we'll touch on what's deemed substantial change as well. The 18 ruling, really that goes to that capacity discussion that we talked about with small cell. It touches on macro sites, but it has a focus on small cell and thereby 5G implementation throughout the country. It also puts additional aesthetic constraints on local jurisdictions as far as what we can evaluate. It was provided a presumptive small cell fee. So no matter what it actually costs the city to evaluate a small cell application, you have to charge this fee as a maximum. And so that was the prescription stated there. So a little bit more on shot clocks. I won't burden you too much with it, but in 2009, that declaratory ruling really focused on the macro sites, which gave 90 days for the co-location. So existing facility, they're coming in and placing a new wireless carrier on that existing facility and or expanding the existing facility. You have 90 days from the time they submit a site plan to the time that building permit is approved. We're pretty fast as a city. We review metrics like you would not believe. But what we try and do, that's still a quick time frame to go from preliminary plan first submittal to final approval of a building permit and you're starting construction. For new sites, it is a little bit more lenient in that it provides for 150 days. So when you have greenfield development, you have nothing on the site currently, you want to go in there and place a wireless facility, 150 days from the start to the end. Now I will say with the shot clocks, those timeframes are told or paused when we issue comments out to a developer or wireless provider. Meaning if they're in for 30 days for a review, we issue first review comments, clock stops until they resubmit. Once they resubmit, game on, you better get it through the process quickly. The 18 order was really focused on timeframes for those small cell facilities, again, seeking to implement the 5G rollout across the country. A little bit shorter time frame for those, being that it's intended to hopefully have less impacts. So 60 days for the co-location on those, 90 days for new sites. I will tell you, for small cell sites within the city, I want to say that we have probably 2 small cell sites that are on private property. The remainder are located within the right-of-way, particularly since the 2017 legislation from the state, because they don't need to go through any sort of separate process for it. They jump straight to building permits. Substantial change, what does that mean? Ultimately, it's focused on increases in height or width. And what it states is that if there is an increase of 10% or 20 feet or less of either height or width, then at that point, the local jurisdiction cannot require any sort of preliminary review. So for us, preliminary review means site plan, where we're providing out notice to surrounding property owners. We're conducting a review of the facility as it relates to placement and those sorts of things. Ultimately, if it's less than that 10% or 10% or less or 20 feet or less, then at that point, it can just jump to building permits. If it's over that, we have the ability to review for those preliminary designs. But ultimately, the way that we have structured the code is to try and make sure that we're capturing those, scenarios that are going to be an issue up front, so that when a co-location comes along, we aren't burdened by having to review that preliminary review. They can jump to building permits, and or if we're evaluating it, there's not really a need to further evaluate a site plan or something along those lines. Usually what we do is we get an inquiry from a provider. We evaluate whether or not it meets that threshold. Most of the time it's under the threshold, they go straight to building permits. When it's over and it's a stealth facility, then we're evaluating, does it defeat the stealth intention of the facility? The most common one we get that it would seem counterintuitive why they would even propose it would be a monopalm, so a faux palm tree. Their proposal for co-location is to place antenna right under the antenna that's outside of the fronds, and they want to put dead fronds over it. So I'll get into as we touch on the aesthetics, but ultimately what our evaluation has yielded is we have a landscape ordinance. So if the intention of the design is to mimic elements of a palm tree, we have certain landscape maintenance criteria that a tree be maintained in a healthy fashion. So you shouldn't have a palm tree that is head to toe in dead fronds. That defeats the purpose of the stealth design. It doesn't look like the other palm trees in the area. So that's one method that we've sought to try and combat what I would say is marginal design efforts, in order to try and make sure that the stealth is truly something that the community can at least appreciate as something more than a non-stealth design. So 2018, that's really where we got to the aesthetic constraints, and there's one other element that I want to touch on for the 18 ruling. But with respect to aesthetics, it really focused on ensuring that we are not making arbitrary decisions from a stealth design standpoint. If we are calling for something, it should be something that is placed within our code, within our standards. So there are some communities that have a specific prescription for the number of fronds that has to be on a wireless facility. We took a little bit of a different approach and placed within our ordinance imagery to try and convey ultimately what is good stealth design and what is bad stealth design. Yes, it lends itself to subjectivity, but we try and implement it in a fashion that is objective, and to the point of the discussion about the monopalms, we're trying to implement it so it integrates within the context of the area and mimics that thing that it's supposed to look like. I apologize. The other item that I wanted to cover here is this 18 ruling made a point to say local jurisdictions, if you allow a wireless facility on any, even if it's your private property, so city facilities, sports complex, sewer treatment facility, city hall, if you allow it on one of your city sites, you are opening the door to every city site, whether you want it there or not. So since that 18 order, Dan Nissen, he is probably should be considered the city librarian, but he has so much historical knowledge and is so integral to the city that he has coordinated with planning on every effort that's been proposed at a private property site that's owned by the city to ensure that we are complying with what position the city has taken, and that's not to allow any wireless facilities on city-owned property since that time, so that we are not opening the door to anywhere and everywhere that's owned by the city. Consequences. They made sure to put a lot of information about consequences within not only the legislation, but also the subsequent orders that follow that legislation. What it boils down to is if, and we'll touch on the time frame and process, but if we don't achieve the measures that are identified within the legislation and within those specific orders, an application that we receive is deemed approved. Now, what does that mean? You know, can we simply not look at it and they just move forward? No, they would have to go through a process for it. So the better path for them is to try and work with the city, because ultimately the legal system is not the quickest system within our country. So they have to go through what's called judicial review. And then for any evaluation of wireless facilities that is deemed to have been in violation of the health prohibition for evaluation of emissions, they have an expedited process to overrule the local jurisdiction. So it's basically a fast track to say, city, you're wrong, this is going in, it doesn't matter what you say. So back to that discussion of partnership, we try and have those conversations up front with the provider and, you know, really get them to work with us. They don't have to in every situation, as you can see by this, but ultimately they want to get through the process as quickly as possible, and that route is coordination. So there's a considerable amount of categories to go through, but effectively there's 4 that most court cases boil down to when you're going through judicial review. So what that means is a city or local jurisdiction has either not acted within the appropriate time frame, and or they have denied it for criteria that they cannot, that does not fall under their purview, or that they're prohibited from evaluating based on. And those go down to evaluation of service for the facility. So a while ago, a lot of jurisdictions were attempting to say, you don't need another tower, you have enough coverage, we don't need to see a proposal for a facility in this area. Ultimately, that provider has the best information and knowledge about where their signal needs are. And so the legislation and the FCC orders combine to say, you cannot evaluate based on your opinion or evaluation city of what the emissions or transmission needs are from wireless facilities. The other item is really what we end up hearing from residents, and that's in regards to property values, that's regarding aesthetics and general opinions about wireless facilities. When you evaluate a ratio of the court cases, a lot of them come down to those unsubstantiated things, at least what the FCC and legislation states are unsubstantiated, in order to deny a case. Meaning, if we deny it based on those elements, if there's an inkling that, you know, we said that it's going to lower the property value and that's why we denied it, they have this path to remediate their circumstances and get approval. Shot clocks, like I said, they have that expedited opportunity if there's a shot clock violation. And then equal treatment, similar to, you know, everything we evaluate, we try and evaluate based on the use rather than the end user. I'm cheap, so I don't have one of the name brand providers. I have a third-party provider. So I can't favor that provider when we're reviewing something and deny others. We can only evaluate based on the use. So,
Which provider is that?
I can certainly convey that after the meeting if you'd like. Very great deal, though. For sites within the city, we get a lot of questions as far as what are the common sites that we see. And a lot of the concern, again, goes back to health and the placement in relation to particularly vulnerable populations from a societal viewpoint, and particularly with kids. So I wanted to touch on, where we see a lot of wireless facilities, and ultimately, high schools are a prime spot for those wireless facilities. The reason for that is the ball field lights. Those are typically the most vertical element that you're going to find within an area or a subdivision. That's the highest verticality that they can place on, and then they don't have to have their own infrastructure. They can simply place on that pole, and you'll see some images as we go through of those sorts of facilities. There are some on elementary school sites, not as many, but we don't have the same ball field lighting conditions on elementary sites. The 3 sites that we have in Peoria, one of them's not even on a ball field light. It's simply a separate monopalm that's placed on the school site. Another prime spot is power lines. So if you see those big, I can't recall what they're phrased as, but I think it's either H or A frame power line corridor. You'll often see panels on those. Those panels are usually cell antenna that are being placed on there, and we have some images of that. Shopping centers, because you have a high concentration of people, they want to get that signal as close as possible to their end users. So you'll see usually in the back end of parking lots, near service bays for grocery stores or Home Depots, you'll see those wireless facilities there. And then religious sites. One of the images that we had shown was a church facility. You had seen the religious banner on what I'll term the tripod. And that's ultimately a location where they have an opportunity to disguise their elements in association with the symbolism that's intended for those sites. So here, just some quick images. This is at one of our high schools within the city. You can see it's actually flanking both sides of the ball field, and the height difference between the two. They're trying to reach different areas and different boundaries with those different heights. Usually what we'll see for a wireless facility is a height of anywhere from 65 to 80 feet. Ultimately, that's based on a couple of things: how they tilt the antenna, the power transmission that's being sent out of those antennas, and then where those recipients are. Here is one of the power line corridors, and you can see that on that sequential one in the background, they actually include another wireless facility there. This is not the best monopalm within the city. However, this is one that
I have to ask, and I'm not trying to be funny. Are those spikes? I mean, oh, hold on, that is a tree. It's supposed to be a tree.
It
Okay.
is supposed to be a tree. So this is a
Interesting
site
design.
that we've actually had several code issues on. And you'll see at the bottom, where you can clearly see the antenna, at the bottom of that is kind of the slendering of the trunk, I guess you could say. That's often referred to as the pineapple. And what they'll do is they will place additional antenna within there, and the remote radio heads, the RRHs, will be placed on the back of those to emit more power from those antenna.
Nice. And now this is suggestion. This is suggested, right? I just want to reiterate that. We could go for nicer designs here in Peoria. Here, I want to repeat,
that's
want to
correct.
repeat
This
that
is
for
an
all the
older
residents
site.
looking.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gleason. Please continue.
So this is a site that I think ultimately sought to implement design that really fit in with the context of the site that it was located on, so that it blends well. This is a church, religious facility within the city, and they constructed it as if it were, a bell tower or an ornamental religious item, so that it blends in well but still provides the height and transmission value that they need from it. This was one of the last sites in the city prior to that 2018 ruling by the FCC that opened up all the city locations. So this is at one of the fire stations, and just wanted to provide an example of, this is kind of frozen in time in that we won't see more of these unless there's a city policy change to allow that. Common questions, I think we touched on a lot of them, so I won't belabor them too much here, but why can't they choose a different site? Well, ultimately that goes back to the evaluation of they need it within a certain area, and they're identifying that their emissions needs and their signal needs are within the boundary of the proposed site that they're looking at. So we don't have a lot of latitude. The example of the small cell site in the person's front yard, we sought to move it basically to the what ended up being the corner of the street, so that we could move it as far away from as many houses as possible, but still be within their location area. So it's not a whole lot of latitude in that respect. Height, why can't they have a lower facility? It really just depends on signal. They're proposing it at a certain height. We have to evaluate it based on that. But within the zoning ordinance, we have specific criteria that seeks to provide a carrot and stick structure, that I would call it. And we'll talk about that a little bit as it relates to process. But ultimately, we're seeking to incentivize good design within the city and locations that may not disrupt the fabric of the community as much. Did you have some? Okay. Health. This is the most common concern that we get. Ultimately, we are preempted without a shadow of a doubt on the health aspect of it. And it's not, it's hard to explain that to people, because ultimately, their property, their neighborhood, their community, it's an emotional issue for them. And so if they're concerned about something, they get, worried that the city isn't implementing something for it. In this case, it's something that we just don't have the ability to review based on. And design, why can't you make it look different? We get proposals and we try and work with them on what that ultimately looks like in order to fit in with the community. We have one in right now where their proposal was for an 80-foot tall elm tree where there are no elm trees even remotely close. So we're trying to coordinate with them, because we can't specify what design they do. We can simply specify how we can try and integrate it into the community, and ultimately ensuring that it is stealth to an acceptable measure. We can't be overly prescriptive with it based on those FCC orders. So I just spent a whole lot of time getting you back to where Lori had you 2 weeks ago. And I'll be much briefer on this part, so that hopefully there's some semblance of game viewing at the end of this. So conditional use permit, that's going back to that carrot and stick scenario. We're trying to incentivize providers to go through a principally permitted use that's deemed in the ordinance. And the way that we've structured that is if you are a non-stealth design, doesn't matter anything else, you are going through a conditional use permit. Time is money, and conditional use permits equal hearing notices, they equal additional timeframes. So if we can get them through a process quicker by having a design that better integrates with the community, ultimately that's what we want to strive for. And so with that stealth design, we require it for any principally permitted wireless facility. We do not require it for conditional use permits, but we highly encourage it. The other element of permitted versus conditional is calling for additional height. We want to get the height context appropriate to the extent possible. So if we can incentivize a lower height that still meets their needs, we've again made that a principally permitted use, versus if you want to go higher, even if it's a stealth design, you have to have that conditional use permit. So it's trying to incentivize as much as possible what fits in with the community. So what does principally permitted mean from a review process standpoint? Again, we have that 150-day maximum for new sites, and I'll just be covering new sites so that we don't belabor the point too much. But that does mean site plan and then ultimately building permit. All of that start to finish has to be within that 150 days. Now, when you transition over to a conditional use permit, you add a layer to that process, and ultimately staff cannot approve a site plan for a use that requires a conditional use permit until that CUP is approved. So what that means is, it ends up pushing us really close and makes it a really tight time frame, particularly once you get into CDs or construction documents to get those building permits. So, we're trying to incentivize it and still meet those time frames to get what the community hopes for and expects. We've talked about why conditional use permits. Again, it's trying to incentivize that better design through a principally permitted use, and or making sure that we have additional evaluation when they're going for things like additional height, that we're providing that extra level of process and evaluation. Our review criteria, and this is conditional versus permitted for wireless facilities, has to be wholly based on what's within the ordinance. We cannot simply identify, well, the typical setback, and I'll get into this, but our typical setback is X. You should really be X plus Y. We have to evaluate solely based on what we have stated in here. Something to know about the way that we structured the code is we were very intentional about writing setbacks that were ratio based. And what I mean by that is ensuring that the higher you go, the further back you are from a property line. So trying to have that scale and intensity and proximity all in relation to each other. So if you have a 110-foot, or I'm sorry, a 50-foot tower, you would then have a 60-foot setback, and it would increase as each incremental increase occurs with the height of the facility. I won't touch on this too much. I think I've probably spoken too much about it already, but our conditions of approval when we get to wireless facilities has to be that code focused. With conditional use permits on other elements, we have to evaluate, is this arbitrary or capricious? Is it something that is unreasonable? In the case of wireless facilities, going back to that Dillon rule discussion, we have to be ultra prescriptive on what we're evaluating. And really, when it comes to commission, we have to evaluate solely based on what we have an ordinance for. We don't really have the latitude to go beyond that for conditions of approval. So key takeaways is that we have a considerable amount of both federal and state preemptions that limit our capability when reviewing wireless facilities. And ultimately that structures how we go about those reviews and what we evaluate as a part of the review. If we, as a jurisdiction, do not approve wireless facilities, we have to make sure that we're operating within the bounds, and ultimately, all of the orders structure their language in a manner that calls for approval. It doesn't really discuss denial. So in those instances where a jurisdiction evaluates denial of a proposal, if you're looking at anything outside of what's in the ordinance, you're probably looking at that judicial review that we talked about, meaning they're going to take us to court, and in likelihood, if we operate outside of the bounds of the ordinance, they're going to win. Shot clocks, we talked about those, but ultimately, regardless of what process we put in front of it, you could put a fourth, a fifth process in front of these cell towers. You better get them done between day 0 and day 150 for those new facilities. Aesthetic constraints, we structured it specifically to try and get good design so that we weren't prescriptive and ended up with 150 monopalms that have 37 fronds each, that none of which look good because they met the tick count of 37 fronds, and thus it was approved. So we tried to implement those design standards in a measure that provides us leeway to ensure that it's a stealth design, but is not overly prescriptive and just checking a box. And then ultimately health concerns. I probably overstress it, but can't stress it enough as far as our liability when it comes to evaluating cell towers based on RF and or microwave emissions. We simply cannot. If there's evaluation concerns, it has to be having to do with a different measure. We cannot evaluate based on that health criteria. With that very long-winded explanation, I'll turn it to Commission if there's any additional questions.
Commissioners, any questions? That's all right. I checked the score, Commissioner Cottrell. You go ahead. There you go.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Gleason. Listening to all of this, and specifically your shot clock with the CUP, and I love that carrot and stick approach. If you play nice, we'll make it easier for you. The tower was the water tower up there in West Wing. So that was stealth, but that still came before the board as a so why did that have to come as a conditional use permit, even though it was stealth and it looked like they were playing ball?
Yep. Oh, sorry.
No, just said good point made by my fellow commissioner there.
Chair, Commissioner Cottrell, I believe that one came before us because of the height of the facility. So when it reaches a certain height, even if it is a stealth design, we would be looking for that additional level of scrutiny, again, to try and incentivize, hopefully the best context for the community.
Thank you. Any other questions, commissioners? Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Gleason. That was a wonderful, elaborative presentation, and I think that it did the presentation well and justice. So thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, I will move us along to call from the public on any non-agenda items. Are there any requests from the public to comment on non-agenda items? Mrs. Duffy, did I miss any? Okay. Well, we still have to open and close public hearing, I think, for formality, so let's open public comment, close public comment. Thank you, and now what we'll do is we're gonna go ahead and move on to reports from staff, so I'll hand it back to you, Director Hawkes.
Madam Chair, I'll be incredibly brief. Just a couple things. I want to thank Cody for that presentation. He really is the resident expert in our department. He's got a wealth of information. I really appreciate that. I think this is a valuable presentation. I think we're going to look at putting these slides on our website so that to the extent citizens have questions on them, we have a resource to point them to. This is fantastic.
I mean, I hope so. He's the right guy. He knows where all of these are located around the city. I'm going to be spotting them out, and
That's
next
right.
time we'll nerd out. I'm like, did you see? I've seen so many on this
That's right.
corner and that one. So, no, great job, Mr. Gleason. Very much so. It was a hard presentation to get through, and we really just appreciate the city's effort, staff effort on really doing your due diligence at all times. Thank you.
Very much
I
appreciated.
have a-
And then
I have a
the-
quick
the-
comment.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We have one comment from Commissioner
Yeah,
Gaylor.
back to your comment. It was a great presentation. Thank you very much. And I learned a lot. When I was hearing these cases in the Board of Adjustments prior to 2017, we were denying these, and making it very difficult for these developers and the telecom companies. So, seeing what we have to work with now actually makes it easier. I just, as it relates to construction and safety, because I know that you got to get the tower up because you have to do what you're supposed to do. But as it relates to construction safety, because you still have to construct the thing, that they're not placed properly, they can fall down. How do you control that in such a short period of time? And I should have asked this earlier, but I think that's a valid question.
The 150 days is to issuance of the permit. So that doesn't, the construction is outside that time frame. We have standards relating to construction.
So the construction can take longer. There's no limit to the
Correct.
time.
That's
Okay, great.
And I'm sorry, just to close, to point out when our next meeting is, October 16th. So, that's all I
Thank
have.
you, Director Hawkes, and thank you, Commissioner Gaynor, for that very important question. Thank you. Seeing that we have no more reports from staff, we'll move along to reports from commission. Commissioners, any reports? I did have a report today. I had a chance to stop by ALK Asphalt last week, and during their employee blood draw event, which was pretty cool, that they partnered with another Peoria business, Aegis Health Solutions, which was wonderful. For me personally, it was just good to see this business investing into the health of their workforce, right? A lot of people don't think about these things, but now as a planning and zoning commissioner, I do. These are the people that are maintaining our roads, that are doing the building, that are doing the sidewalks, and they're upholding our infrastructure. And so just talking to some of the employees there about how much they love working in Peoria for a Peoria-based business, that made me very happy. And I just know that it's these collaborative efforts, partnerships of successful Peoria businesses that keep our city growing. And so just want to highlight these wonderful workers doing a great job and speaking so highly of our city, because that's what we're attaining, right? People that work, play, and live in this city. And I think for me, putting faces behind those names was great. And I want to continue to uplift all these great businesses that are doing the work. So if there's anyone that I should stop by, please let me know. Our city's doing great, but it takes these businesses to maintain our infrastructure and do those things. And we work closely with several ones, and I wanted to highlight them. So special shout out to Kenya and Nicole, who hosted me while I was there, and the owner, Adam, who loves being a business owner here. Thank you. It's on me again. There we go. So now that we have closed all of the business, I will now close the commission meeting. Thank you.